It's Zelda hype time. There's a lot of things in store that's out in the open and maybe behind the curtain when it comes to The Legend of Zelda, the 35th anniversary celebration, and more possible news on The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. But what is out in the open is the release of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD, one of my favorite Zelda games and Wii games of all time, finally coming to Nintendo Switch, and I'm really excited for the release. But when it comes to that release in July relating to Age of Calamity DLC that's going to be happening throughout the year, the 35th anniversary this year, and the promise of Breath of the Wild 2 news this year, the writing on the wall, just like in the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, seems to be very evident of a possible heavy connection from Skyward Sword HD to Breath of the Wild 2 and vice versa. It's almost as if it's all part of Nintendo's plan to get Zelda fans hyped all over again for Breath of the Wild 2, just like they did with the original Breath of the Wild. And let's break down that connection and what it could be for Breath of the Wild 2. What's up guys, it's HMK once again with another awesome Zelda video. I hope you guys are hyped up for the celebration of Zelda this year, because if Nintendo's not gonna do it, then fine, I'll do it myself. So if you're down for that, be sure to like, favorite, share, and most importantly subscribe to HMK and hit that bell to know when my videos go live on Zelda every week. With that being said, strap on in for the safety of hype, let's dive directly into the noise. Now before we get into the lore aspects between that of Breath of the Wild 2, and Skyward Sword HD, and the entirety of the Zelda chronology, let's take a look at the company and marketing point of view about how Breath of the Wild 2 can connect to Skyward Sword HD. Of course, it's the release time to get people aware of this game. While like most Zelda games, especially console Zelda games, Skyward Sword originally on the Wii did sell pretty well for a video game, but it could have sold more, and of course Skyward Sword HD, with the insanely huge Nintendo Switch fan base and install base, is probably going to sell a good chunk. And of course you would think, but HMK, obviously it's for the 35th anniversary of Zelda and the 10-year anniversary of Skyward Sword. Well sure, that's what Nintendo wants you to think. But of course, just like Twilight Princess HD before it, that came out ahead of the original Breath of the Wild, Skyward Sword HD seems to be getting people primed and ready for the release of Breath of the Wild 2. As if Nintendo is telling you guys, hey, don't forget, there's this other big Zelda game coming on Nintendo Switch, so in the meantime, play this game. And of course, Nintendo is aware about the certain components, both game mechanics and story content, that is carried over from Skyward Sword into Breath of the Wild and more than likely into Breath of the Wild 2, such as sprinting, stamina, and a little bit of climbing. We'll talk about those story components in a bit. So while of course Skyward Sword is the origin story to the entirety of The Legend of Zelda, Skyward Sword is also the origin of a lot of gameplay mechanics that we see in Breath of the Wild and we're probably going to see once again in Breath of the Wild 2. And of course, when we're talking about shared components and mechanics, it has been confirmed that Skyward Sword HD will have amiibo support. Now of course, there is a lot of Zelda amiibo out there. I mean a lot. I'm only missing one, but that's besides the point. If you think that Nintendo is going to put out a quote-unquote new entry, even though it's a remaster of The Legend of Zelda without an accompanying amiibo, then my friend, you got me twisted. And when you think of Skyward Sword, then I think only one of two amiibos could be made, or maybe two amiibos could be made, and that is an amiibo possibly of Fi, the spirit within the Master Sword, or I should say the Goddess Sword, or that of a Loftwing. I mean, we did have Wolf Link in Twilight Princess HD, and we did have Link from Link's Awakening in Link's Awakening. I think it will make a ton of sense if a Loftwing amiibo would be incorporated into Skyward Sword HD. And just like how you're able to carry over data from Twilight Princess HD into Breath of the Wild with the Wolf Link amiibo, summoning Wolf Link in the world of Hyrule, I'm gonna go in line with what some of my Zelda colleagues say about the potential of a Loftwing amiibo, possibly carrying over data from Skyward Sword HD into Breath of the Wild 2, where we could possibly have a Loftwing flying around the grand world of Hyrule. And I don't think it's out of the question, considering that Hyrule in Breath of the Wild and in Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be gigantic. But you would think, what about the possible performance of how we have the constant rendering of a world that will have to be rendered when we fly to the sky on a Loftwing? Well, remember, unlike the original Breath of the Wild 2 is being developed specifically on the Nintendo Switch in mind, because Breath of the Wild was developed on the Wii U. And there is, the hints and whispers about the, Nintendo Switch Pro that's apparently supposed to come out at the end of this year. But yeah, I would love to have some sort of amiibo support or amiibo connection from Skyward Sword HD over into Breath of the Wild 2. You know, that'll help entice players to buy Skyward Sword HD in order to get ready for Breath of the Wild 2. It's all about that explosion of hype that I feel Nintendo is really sitting on for the Zelda 35th anniversary. Just wait and see. But that deals with the mechanics, the game mechanics, between that of Skyward Sword HD and Breath of the Wild 2. But let's talk about those story aspects. If you guys played the original Breath of the Wild and Skyward Sword back on the Wii, then you would know that they share a bunch of narrative points when it comes to that of the goddess Hylia, and even hints on how Malice and the Curse of Demise is connected to that of Calamity Ganon, and we're going to be seeing Calamity Ganondorf in Breath of the Wild 2. And if we take a real good look on Ganondorf in Breath of the Wild 2 when it comes to his dehydrated state and how he may have looked in his prime thanks to the shadow, the silhouette that we see in the trailer, he seems to be channeling a lot of features when it comes to the big, buff, and bold King of Demons Demise. You know, the long, red, flowing hair and the big buff physique that we see in the shadow. Not so buff right now, but give it some time. Maybe he needs to take a bath or two. And considering that Ganondorf's backstory with the Curse of Demise was subtly touched upon within the lore of the original Breath of the Wild, and the fact that we're getting Ganondorf back literally in the flesh, and with the murals that we see in the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, it seems that we might be diving a little more into the Demise and Ganondorf backstory. And to be primed and ready for that, Nintendo knows that players may need to play Skyward Sword in HD form in order to get all of that juicy lore to be ready for that big blowout of a story that could possibly be in Breath of the Wild 2. There's an important history behind that specifically, and there's other important aspects of history behind that of the Master Sword and the Spirit Fi. As within the base game of Breath of the Wild, we know that she still communicates with Zelda and possibly Link in a very limited capacity when compared to that of Skyward Sword. And if you guys don't know who Fi is, then Skyward Sword HD will give you everything you need to know when it comes to the spirit within that of the Master Sword that is bound eternally to the spirit of the hero, and possibly setting up a grand return in Breath of the Wild 2, especially since Fi's lore was expanded ever so much in the DLC Master Trials for the original Breath of the Wild. And like I said before, and I'll say it again, I feel that the Master Sword is going to be extremely important, like more important than it's ever been, possibly against that of Skyward Sword within that of Breath of the Wild 2, to the point where I believe it might be Link's only weapon. And with an importance possibly like that, you're gonna need to know the history behind the Master Sword on how it started as the Goddess Sword. And of course, other little aspects that include that of the elements of the sages that were touched upon that in Skyward Sword, and of course we see throughout that of Ocarina of Time and more games, and maybe even a grand return of the Demon Lord Hikariemr that could be in Breath of the Wild 2 that could assist his master in a new form, in the form of that of Ganondorf. As Hikariemr's fate as Demise's sword is really left up to speculation on what happened to him. Did he run away? Did he fade away? Was he destroyed? Or did he run out of energy, similar to that of how the Master Sword works in Breath of the Wild? See what I did there? And of course, the fact that we're going down deep into the underground of Hyrule within that of Breath of the Wild 2 from the trailer, this aspect of the game could really have real demonic ties to what we know of the demons within the Zelda series, as in Skyward Sword, the demonic realm is literally known as the Underworld. And the Underworld is something that could be explored in Breath of the Wild 2, but it will be pretty nice if you were primed and ready from what we learned in Skyward Sword. And at the end of the day, maybe Skyward Sword HD will have additional content that could push all of this type of narrative, just like a little bit how Twilight Princess HD got the Cave of Shadows. Maybe, but perhaps not. I feel that we're gonna have to wait until another trailer or more information going into the release of Skyward Sword HD this July that can really get us excited for what's going down with Breath of the Wild 2. Summer is coming, guys. E3 time is that magic gaming time. But what do you think about the possible connections that Skyward Sword HD can have on multiple venues going into the release of Breath of the Wild 2 as part of the Zelda 35th anniversary? Leave your comments and theories in the comment section below, and be sure to like, share, favorite, and most importantly subscribe to HMK for more Zelda content every week. Big thanks to my Patreon supporters for helping making this video happen. If you want to find out how you can support HMK for just $1 a month, check out my info in the description box below. Alright guys, until the next Zelda video, this has been HMK, and I'll check you guys later.